Thank you. Oh, that's very generous, gosh. The chairs get better each time here. Hello and evening, Croeso, Noswaith Dda. Welcome to the third event in the In My Craft series, a series about the craft of writing, named after the famous poem by Dylan Thomas, In My Craft or Sullen Art, in which he suggests towards not just how he writes, but also why he writes. And I suppose that's why I chose that title for this series of writing, of events with writers, because that's what I'm interested in talking about, I suppose, is the how and the why of writing, with poets and novelists and short story writers. And this evening, I'm thrilled to say, the award-winning author of narrative non-fiction, Ben Rawlins. So to start off with, if you could please join me in welcoming Ben to Swansea University. Thank you. Welcome, Ben. So Ben is the author of three works of narrative non-fiction. Radio Congo, which is a travel narrative, is that fair to say? A travel narrative through the Congo and into the Congo, both physically but also psychologically and emotionally. And then City of Thorns, an extraordinary book about the world's largest refugee camp, and most recently, The Tree Line, The Last Forest and the Future of Life on Earth. We'll be touching upon all of these books, but to start off with, as I've been doing with all of the writers in this series, I want to sort of pull back and talk about the craft of the art first and where it started for you. What was your individual journey towards research? If it was writing, I think it was writing political speeches, is that right?
Yeah.
But at some point, that turned into books. How did that happen?
Well, I'm sure some of you can relate to this, but it was very intimidating for me to ever think that I might be able to write a book. So it was I think, a notion out there that might be something I could do or would try and do at some point in my life. But I definitely didn't have the confidence off the bat to say, I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to write a book. I've got a niece who's written a novel age 12. That was never me. So I enjoyed writing, I enjoyed words, I enjoyed reading. I studied English and history and Swahili literature actually at university. So the literature was a passion. But my career, as with many people, took a turn into more professional settings, so writing speeches, politics, human rights research, things like that. And I think there was a moment when I was in my 30s actually, I think, but after having spent a decade or so, a little bit under a decade, writing speeches for politicians mostly, I thought, well, I'm going to write something for myself. And the journey to Congo was really an experiment in several ways. So at the beginning of the book, I talk about this idea of going to see on the other side of the lake, because Tanzania is a very peaceful country where I had studied Swahili, where I had worked in Africa for periods of time. And I thought, well, the people across the lake are also Swahili speakers. They're also, tied by bonds of kinship and culture and so on. How different can it be, even though on the other side of the lake is Congo, this scary place where we have no news and there was absolutely no information coming out from what was happening on the other side of the lake, other than these sporadic reports of war hundreds of miles away. So it was an experiment kind of in human terms just to see what was happening, but it was also an experiment. I thought, well, if I've got anything to say and if I've got anything to contribute, it might have, this might be an opportunity for me because I was a Swahili speaker who had studied Swahili at the University of London. I could speak that language. This would be a key for me into that place, into that culture. It might mean I've got a different angle. I can go and report on things that other people can't. So that was sort of the experiment. And I thought, well, I'll try and file a few freelance pieces for the BBC or whoever. None of that panned out. But at the end of that journey, after 4 months, which was a transformational, life-changing experience, going through the war at that time and being looked after by all the people who were on the ground. But at the end of that, I arrived in Nairobi and I met a journalist some of you may have heard of called Paul Salopek, who's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. And I said, I don't know what to do with this. I'm trying to file for the New York Times and this, that, and the other, and can you help? And he said, don't worry about that. You've got a book here. Write that book. So that sort of finally gave me the permission and the confidence to set it all down. And I wrote the book in about 6 weeks. I mean, it was all there, so it came out, very quickly.
And did that happen quite instinctively, or did you, by that time, having had that 4 months of travel, had the travel revealed a structure to you, or a way of doing this? Or actually, were there writers that you had in mind? That, were there any kind of sort of guiding spirits in terms of other writers?
I think I could probably storify it in retrospect, and I could see those patterns, but I think at the time it didn't appear to me like that at all. I was full of the experience, and I had to get it down, and I got it down in all these different sort of almost short stories, like vignettes about different places. And then I approached the question of structure and thought, my God, how do I stitch all of that together?
Right.
And I had a clue. But I was lucky enough to find an agent who was just starting out, who took me on and said, I can see there's promise here. Would you like to work with me in turning this into a book? So we then kind of weaved. The structure wasn't immediately apparent at all. But then it after a lot of hard work, it became clear.
Because, of course, that's the fascinating thing. When we're talking about narrative non-fiction, the emphasis is on that first word, narrative, which is about story.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you've just travelled through the Congo for 4 months. You have lots of true experience. But do you yet have a story? I suppose what I'm asking is, what is your relationship to story as someone who writes, in inverted commas, true books about true things?
So a story, for me, and I've learned, I think, each time. James Baldwin said, each one is a nightmare, or something along those lines. Each one will put you on the rack. A story for me is about finding that journey. So you start somewhere, even if it's a 6-line, 3-line haiku, it starts somewhere and it ends somewhere else. It moves you somewhere. So you start somewhere and you start somewhere else. What happens in between, and how do you get from here to here? And with Radio Congo, I wrestled with that for probably 6 months. Where does this? I've had this experience, and ultimately, the answer to that story, the answer to that question, in that book, was to go back and examine that original motivation and be utterly honest, and say the reason I went was because I thought I was intrigued by what was happening. There was no news from across the lake, and perhaps I might have a chance to sort of find out, but also shed some light for others on what was happening. So I think the guiding light for me is V.S. Naipaul's essay called Finding the Center, which is this kind of circular motion that he describes in some of his own writing, again and again and again, to sort of finally get to the very heart of the narrative. What are you trying to say? So I think it's two things for me. It's that journey. What's the journey? And it's also what's the absolute honest kernel of what you think you have to say in this particular instance.
Yeah, because of course it's a journey that you have to take the reader on, and in order to do that, it's not as simple as just being true to your own experience, is it? So I'm just wondering how that relationship with story shifted over the next 2 books, which were 2 very different propositions. Did you sort of find the story and go, right, okay, there it is, I can see it?
Yeah.
Or was it that you found sort of subject areas or questions, and the story revealed itself to you as you began to research it? Because with this kind of work, story and research are very much linked as well, aren't they?
Yeah, and it's a bit like it's almost a spiritual process. It's kind of like a revelation. You know that there will be, or now at least, having done it 3 times, I know there will be a moment of revelation where it becomes clear, even if I don't know at the beginning what's going to happen. But so with City of Thorns, I then, having written that Congo book, I then went back to Human Rights Watch, which was my job at the time. That's an American human rights research company, a charity, a bit like Amnesty, for those of you that haven't heard of it. So I was working for them in Kenya, and I was sent as part of my work to the Dadaab refugee camp in northern Kenya, and it blew my mind. I thought, I've been living and working in Africa for a decade. How have I never been to this place? How have I never understood how, utterly horrifying but also fascinating it is?
And I think it's worthwhile giving people a sense, if you haven't heard of this place, just the scale of Dadaab as a place.
Oh, it's a city the size of Bristol, in the middle of the desert on the border between Kenya and Ethiopia, and it's been there for 30 years. And there are 3 generations now, people who've had children, whose children have had children in this place, and they can't leave. They can't go back to Somalia, to the war. They're not accepted as citizens within Kenya. They don't have any UN mechanism for being resettled to another country, so they're absolutely stuck. And what's evolved is this sort of closed human experiment almost. It's a bit like those kind of biospace things where they put people in a bubble for years and years. And it's developed its own culture, its own lexicon, its own way of life. So I was completely fascinated. I thought, I have to find a way to communicate this to other people. This is a tragedy, but it's also a complete window on what for me, and I'm sure others from a distance would see as the UN system, the humanitarian world. And this is a real insight into actually what's happening on the ground. So again, I didn't know what's the story. Am I in the story? And I took a decision quite early on. This has to be not about me. This is not about the Western journalist going there. This has to be about the people who are there. So what was interesting to me was the day job was going in as a human rights researcher, basically interviewing people about all the traumatic things that had happened to them in Somalia, in order to establish prima facie cases on war crimes and things like that about what was happening in Somalia. But actually what was really interesting was what was happening in the camp.
Yeah, there.
So I thought, this is EastEnders. This is Coronation Street. There's a Somali girl falling in love with the Sudanese guy, and her family want to kill him. And she's going and throwing herself on the sand in front of the UN and saying, I'm going to kill myself unless you put me in the safe zone. And all this sort of intra-life and politics of this camp, which was fascinating. So I thought, I've got to find a way of putting those people at the heart of the story. I've got to actually tell it through their eyes. And then I read a book called Behind the Beautiful Forevers by Catherine Boo, which students of narrative nonfiction have probably read, and if not, will read soon, I'm sure, which is she's a New Yorker writer, and she did lots and lots of research to get inside the lives of these individual characters and tell the story through their eyes. And I thought, that's the way to tell this story. And so that then was that opened the door then to, okay, I need to find 6 people, 9 people. In the end, I had 9. Yeah. To tell this story of EastEnders in the refugee camp.
Now, in order to do that, the essential component of the story is the scene, and to bring a reader into the scene, you need to enter it, obviously, through their senses and through detail. Now, this is quite sort of a geeky kind of a mechanical question, but I think that we've probably got writers in the audience, and I'm fascinated to know as well, what have been your individual techniques in terms of gathering that detail? Obviously, you're there, but you're trying to interact with people as well, and you're trying to communicate with them as clearly as possible. And I know from experience that, a notebook, a camera, a recorder can sort of get in the way of that. Yeah. So what are your individual sort of techniques? Because I'm made to think of the famous writer of narrative nonfiction, Gay Talese, who said that he never carried any notebooks. He just had lots and lots of thin bits of card, because he could just take out one at a time and no one would see him writing. So he was almost there, sort of not observing but observing. Yeah. What was your approach to that, especially in that environment?
So I did lots of different things. I spent basically about between 2 and 3 years going back again and again, lots of extended visits to the camp. And it was even more complicated than that, because the UN guidance was you weren't supposed to be in the camp for more than an hour on your own, and I had to travel with security guards. So I had a truck full of armed policemen following me around as well.
So you're trying to have these intimate conversations with a truckload of armed policemen?
Yes, I try and interview Muna about her relationship with a Sudanese boy and how she was, she was very graphic about their sex life and all this stuff and the drama of the relationship. And there were 4 armed policemen sitting outside having tea. Right. So I don't think, it wasn't so much the sort of paraphernalia and the note-taking. It was more the fact that I wasn't there all the time, and I couldn't be there all the time because I could only come and stay for an hour, and then I had to leave. So I couldn't live in the house with these people and really get that perspective. So I did a number of different things. I used the forensic interviewing techniques of Human Rights Watch to talk to people about the past and what had happened. So one of the things I've done with Amnesty and Human Rights Watch is you have to reconstruct a crime scene. So you have to, what was he wearing? What did he say? How do you know that? What was the insignia on the uniform and so on. And then also applying a level of rigor to, you have to then ask the questions another time from a different angle and all that kind of stuff. So there was the forensic interviewing. There was an element of if I could be there, then I was. And then you have a separate problem, which is, do you put yourself in the scene? Because the reader is asking themselves as they read this, how do you know that? And then the third thing was to have a fixer who I gave a video camera to, and he would go and spend time with some of the characters and interview them, and also video their workplaces or things like that. So then I would do post hoc reconstruction. I would go and visit, so there's several scenes there where I would go and visit the market or the internet cafe where an event took place. In one case there was there was a shooting, so I would go and I went to see the site and saw, the bullet holes and all this sort of stuff after the event, very much like a forensic investigator actually, and then talk to people who were there about what they saw and then reconstruct that story. So one of the things... And
you feel that as a writer it's essential to turn up in the physical space? If
you're trying to tell a true story, it really helps. I wouldn't say it's essential, because ultimately it's about the credibility of the story. Does the reader read on? Do they believe you? Do they carry on? And as long as you're doing enough to do that, I think one of the things I learned from City of Thorns is you probably don't need to sweat it as much.
Oh, really? Yeah.
But I had this sort of New Yorker fact checker on my head saying, how do you know that?
Yeah.
And what it did do was it yielded a very rich, vivid portrait to really take you there, and that's what I wanted to achieve from a political point of view. I write because I want to move people, because I want them to be transformed, or not necessarily radicalized, but moved and politicized. So and
changed in some way.
And changed.
Yeah.
So the detail matters in delivering that transporting experience.
Yeah. Well, I think this would be a great time if we could experience some of that transportation ourselves, if that's right, and if you could hear something from City of Thorns.
Absolutely. So I'll just say at the outset, this is a post hoc reconstruction, because I wasn't in the room, and maybe that will help frame how you understand it. So there are 9 characters in City of Thorns, and the first one, the main one, the sort of hero of the story, is a young man called Guled. It's only the poor left in Mogadishu now, said a man who had fled the fighting to the Dadaab refugee camps in Kenya. But that wasn't the whole story. To flee, one needed 3 things: money, courage, and imagination. Money, because nothing in Somalia was free, and transport was especially expensive when in demand. Courage, because the route south was booby-trapped with checkpoints, lawless militias, and bandits that attacked 1 in 3 vehicles heading for the border. And imagination, because for a mind shaped by the confusion of war, the ability to imagine that life might be different or better elsewhere is an uncommon leap. It helped if you knew someone who lived there. Guled knew one boy, Noor, who had run away to Kenya, but Guled's sister, his only family, was in Mogadishu, and solidarity was in many ways as important as survival. That was why, despite the risks, in October 2010, he was still here, and why he went to school as normal that October morning. At 7 o'clock, having swept his classroom, Guled lined up in the courtyard along with the other remaining pupils for the assembly that they called energizing. As usual that day, one boy read out the results of the sports competitions between the classes, and another recited verses from the Quran. 2 girls read poems, one in English and one in Somali. Another did a comedy sketch. Afterwards, Guled's class teacher, Abdi Rashid, made an announcement. In recent weeks, Al-Shabaab, the militant group, had started kidnapping children from some other schools in the city. So, he said, go straight home after school, and if you see Al-Shabaab, avoid them. That there were still children in school at all seemed remarkable. That year, only a quarter of those left in the country were enrolled in primary schools. And in Mogadishu, even half of those had dropped out. Still, some students carried on, sweeping the classrooms, ringing the bell, running the gauntlet, and showing up for class. Like Al-Shabaab, the teachers were committed to an idea, desperately tugging the soul of a generation from the clutches of cynicism and despair. At break time, Guled bought samosas. In the school uniform of yellow shirt and blue trousers, he and the other children stood out as one of the few slabs of color amid the white rubble and jagged gray ruins of the city. The Indian Ocean shimmered blue on the horizon. The students threaded in and out of the school gates and bunched around the snack stall, habituated to the sound of gunfire in the distance. After break, Guled returned to his classroom and rearranged the desks while another boy cleaned the blackboard. Discipline was rarely necessary in Shebele Primary. What happened next? He remembers precisely. The teacher, Abdi Rashid, wrote the date in the top left-hand corner of the blackboard and the subject, geography. As he faced the class, his face appeared taut, stretched in alarm. Turning, Guled saw 5 men at the back of the classroom, swathed in black, with only their eyes showing. They shouldered machine guns and calmly surveyed the room. 2 of them moved towards the teacher and, silently, took him by the arms and marched him outside. 3 other figures strode among the desks and began pointing at the bigger boys as the class watched, rigid. The pointing was accompanied by a voice, commanding in Somali, "Stand up, stand up, stand up." A finger halted on Guled. His lips trembled, his stomach loosened. The room was silent, brittle as glass. "Stand up," said the man. Guled's immediate thought was that he was going to die, either in battle or for a crime he could not yet comprehend, for playing football maybe, for wearing shorts, for listening to music, for going to a secular school. His offenses were several. His second thought was that he would never see home again. 6 boys were on their feet now. The class held their breath. No one moved. One of the fighters announced with foreboding, "You are going to fight the Christians and the infidel government. This will be your last day at school." With that, the armed men hustled the chosen ones down the corridor and out into a pickup truck with canvas sides that was waiting on the street outside. 2 other trucks crammed with gunmen were behind. Guled saw the teacher, Abdi Rashid, was already in the truck before he felt hands over his face and a blindfold cover his eyes. He could hear the other classes still blithely chanting their lessons. It had taken less than a minute for Guled to become one of the 2,000 children kidnapped that year in Somalia. His heart was hammering out of control, but he was puzzled that his hands were free, not tied, and so he gripped the bench beneath him as the truck zigzagged at speed through Mogadishu's gridded streets.
Well, thank you. What was the effect of you writing A City of Thorns on the people who are featured in it? And I suppose, what was their response?
So one of the things I'm quite pleased about with this book is that there's no I in the book at all, apart from the prologue, which talks about my work with Human Rights Watch and sort of why I came to be doing what I was doing. And then in the epilogue, which talks about reading the book back to the subjects
Right.
in order to get their approval, but also their feedback in case I've got anything wrong. So I really enjoyed writing the epilogue because finally I could just tell it straight. But also the story of the feedback and the response of the participants, the characters in the book, to their own story is also hilarious and really instructive. So there's a character called Nisho who's a real kind of wide boy in the market, who's a hustler, and you know I read it back to him, and he's like yeah, and it's in some parts of it it's actually really embarrassing. It's not, you know, it doesn't cast him in a favourable light at all.
Yeah.
But he doesn't care about that. He's just saying, is it accurate? Is it true? You know, yes, it's true. I am like that. I am a fool. And so he really enjoyed that process. But it also then is an opportunity to reflect on a lot of the difficulties and the moral dilemmas of that situation. The power relationships, the representation and all the rest of it.
Well, exactly. That's what I was wondering. Because obviously conversations around who gets to tell whose stories are incredibly alive right now.
Yeah.
And very often, as they should be, especially in fiction.
Yeah.
When you get to narrative non-fiction, have you also sort of met that challenge or that question?
Yeah, so I did a reading in Nairobi,
Yeah.
and there was a Kenyan journalist who put up their hand and said, how dare you, a white British man who colonized our country, come here and tell this story? And one of the people who's featured in the book, a refugee called Fish is his nickname, and he's called Fish in the book. He was in the audience because for various reasons, if you bribe the Kenyan police, you can escape the checkpoints, you can leave the camp, you can come to Nairobi. So anyway, he's adept at that. So he was in the audience, and before I had the chance to answer, he stood up and said, I'm going to answer for Ben. My name is Fish. I'm in the book.
Wow.
And I'd like to say thank you and congratulations for coming and telling our story. You are a Kenyan journalist sitting here in Nairobi. It's a $10 bus ride to get to northern Kenya. None of you sons of bitches have ever bothered to come and tell our story. And the Kenyan media is historically incredibly racist towards Somali refugees. So I was all about ready to sort of apologize and say, well, you know, I'm sorry, but you know, I'm doing my best and this sort of stuff. But that gave me pause. I thought, well, okay, yes, I mean, there are circumstances that have allowed me to tell that story and have, you know, more time to do that investigation. But nonetheless, it's a balance between, you know, trying to do the right thing with the resources you have, recognizing the power imbalances, stating them plainly, trying to negotiate them honestly, whilst also in some cases calling out the racism of Kenyans against Somalis. I mean, there's no law against that.
No.
So yes, it's a thorny problem, but I don't think I would always resist the idea that people can only tell stories about, you know, people that look like them or speak the same language, or, you know, the history of literature in many cultures is all about empathy. It's about trying to put yourself in other people's shoes. So, you know, we have to be honest about the power dynamics. We have to be working very hard to be as inclusive as possible and to allow as many people to have those same opportunities.
Exactly.
But that, you know, it's better that book is out there than it's not out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to move on to the tree line now, and I should have said at the start that there'll be an opportunity. I'll leave 15, 20 minutes for questions from the audience. So you can have a chat with Ben as well. But from City of Thorns, a book about a single place, a place that is no place, to The Tree Line, a book about many places, but also a book with a lot of the I in it that you said that you don't like having in a book. And now there's suddenly a lot of I, there's a lot of Ben in here. An extraordinary book about how the tree line, the global tree line, is on the move due to rising temperatures across the globe. I've got lots of questions about this, but I suppose initially I want to come back to that idea of structure, because I know that this is something that you've quoted a lot, the idea that character is structure, whether you're telling a story in fiction or film or in narrative non-fiction. Who or what was the character in the tree line that defined the structure?
Okay.
That's an easy one.
Damn, that's a difficult one.
Well, in Radio Congo it was tough because I had to put in the end, the structure that made sense was my own journey. In the City of Thorns, the structure was really tough because you're trying to do the narrative arc of these 9 different characters, and so interleaving all of those was really difficult. But the tree line, I knew that I wanted to write about climate change. I was, ever since, City of Thorns is to some extent a book about climate change because all of the refugees and the displacement is driven by climate. The conflict is at root a climate conflict in terms of the environmental change in the Horn of Africa. So having had that initial insight there, and then various reasons to do with life and falling in love and having kids and ending up in Wales, I still was then very gripped with how do I keep writing about climate change from this experience. And I was very interested in catching a glimpse of the future, and the Arctic, of course, is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. But how to tell that story? What is a structure that makes sense to tell that story, that's innovative, that's different, that will carry people along, that will potentially be, not a climate change book, like a sort of polemic, like David Wallace Wells' Uninhabited World, or
that would still be a story.
But would be a story, exactly. So, because it's narrative non-fiction is what I do. I don't just do polemics.
Yeah.
So, because I believe that a story is the best way of transporting people and moving them and giving them information. So, how to do that? And I was fascinated by this idea of this kind of green ring around the top of the world, this green halo of forest, which was now moving north. But I have a young family. I can't travel 3,000 miles around the top of the world, even if it was physically possible, which it isn't, So how to sort of break that down? And then I realized that the boreal forest is made up of very few species, because as the ice caps have come down and retreated and come down and retreated, as the vegetation has colonized the space that the ice has left, that vegetation comes from much lower down. And so what you get is a kind of banding of species around the top of the earth. So in Scotland, the tree line is made of pine. In Scandinavia, it's birch. In Siberia, it's larch. In Alaska, it's spruce. In Canada, it's a mix of spruce and balsam poplar. And in Greenland, it's rowan. So that was a writerly gift. There are 6 species, there are 6 characters, there are 6 journeys, there are 6 chapters, and each of the chapters then is threaded. So the reason why there's an I is because what's the linking thread between those characters, and the answer is me going to those places.
Right.
So it was the demands of the story that brought me back in reluctantly into the picture.
Yeah. Now, you said that you didn't have, sort of 9 lives to interleave. But what you do have that has to be sort of imbricated throughout this story is a lot of science, a lot of pretty hard science, a lot of it very shocking as well, and I'll ask you about that in a bit. But I suppose the question is, as a storyteller, and I think this wasn't something that you'd had to approach in your previous books, how did you approach that calibration of the science and the storytelling? Because it's vital, it's there, it is part of the story. but you could argue that it's a natural break on storytelling sometimes as well. So
Yeah.
how did you approach that?
I really don't like reading those books where you get the sort of personal introduction, the scene setting, and then there's a break, and then there's 2 pages of science or facts or geography or history, and then there's a break, and then you're back into the personal situation at that particular moment. For me, that breaks the magic. So what I tried to do here was a lesson from City of Thorns, which was to see the science through the eyes of the narrative. So the narrative is the journey, the character as structure. The character is the tree. The story is what's happening to the tree under the influence of warming. And to tell that story, there needs to be some movement from me in terms of linking the people and the places, and there needs to be you need to pave the road, as it were. Some of that paving has to be science. So why is the birch tree on the move? Why is the birch tree, why is that movement bad or complicated or difficult? What does it mean? Where are the pieces of the story that require the science? So when you have a hook, then you can hang lots of baubles, as it were. I mean, my metaphors are mixed all over the place here. So you're paving a road,
sort of linked to trees still, it's fine.
But you're also decorating the tree. Yeah. So you're decorating the tree. You can hang those baubles on the tree when you've got the opportunity, but only when you've got something to hang it on.
Yeah.
So it's no good just chucking it in there.
Right.
It's got to relate to that overall structure.
Yeah. We touched upon change earlier in terms of hoping to change a reader or to take them on some sort of a transformative journey. But like I said, a lot of the science in here and a lot of the stories that you encounter are shocking. I mean, just off the top of my head, that jump of the amount of emissions produced by wildfires in Siberia from sort of 1 or 2 megatons a year to 16 megatons a year.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of stuff in here that is scary. It's really scary. I'm interested to know, how did that change you? How has this book affected or changed you? Because it struck me that as you went on these 6 separate journeys, exploring these 6 characters of these trees, you constantly had to face some very, very hard facts with, as you said, your young family at home, the children who are going to grow into this world.
Well, I think the first thing to say is I'm glad that the science is surprising and shocking, because I think that is part of it. And part of the ambition of this book was to sort of smuggle the science in, because nobody wants to read 1,000 scientific papers. I wouldn't recommend it. It's least of all, it's depressing. But you can't assimilate that amount of information. So the idea of this is a much more accessible travel book, journey of adventure and discovery, where you get the science blended in. The way that it affected me, in a way, actually, is there's a sort of glimpse of that in the piece of the book that I'd like to read. So part of the answer is there. But the other is also in the epilogue, which is coming to terms with all of that. Where does it leave us? And as I'm sure many of you have heard some of the same things I've been listening to over the last few days with COP27 happening in Egypt, is that there's a lot of psychology now around how we process this information, how we make sense of this difficult moment, how we try and see ourselves afresh with a sort of different understanding of the past and what that means for the future and so on. So there's a kind of reappraisal that happens, and at the same time there is a need, I think an urgent need for action and meaningful engagement. And that really is what led to Black Mountains College and the work that I and Owen's involved as well back in the Brecon Beacons, where I'm now 100% engaged in trying to educate future generations in the skills and the mindsets that are required to make sense of this moment and prepare for uncertainty. So it was a big, for me, it was a huge, not a gear shift, but a handbrake turn, really,
Right.
in sort of how do we, what does this science mean? This science means this changes everything, to quote Naomi Klein's book.
Yeah.
And we it means that the past is a foreign country. The way we've understood the past is a foreign country. Our ideas about the future are completely foreign. We've actually got to really reassess, a lot of received wisdom, contemporary mindsets, contemporary culture, and that's incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
And it's beyond the scope of that book. But I think what the epilogue does, and why there's this very grand subtitle, which is The Last Forest and the Future of Life on Earth, I think is because it does pose fundamental questions about the way in which we've come to understand ourselves in contemporary society. And that's both an opportunity, and the reason why the book ends on a hopeful note is that that's both an opportunity as well as a huge challenge. There's nothing particularly, there's lots of good things about the status quo, but there's a lot of problems
Things aren't great. Yeah.
which this is an opportunity to revisit.
Yeah, because as you say, well, as you quoted, this should be changing everything.
Yeah.
It's not yet, though.
No.
And at the heart of that, you feel there is the challenge of narrative, how we are telling this story. There's this incredible asymmetry between what we know and what we've done in response to it over the last 30, 40 years. It's a huge question, but just maybe briefly, from your own experience working on this book, what have we been doing wrong as a society, as societies, in terms of how we have communicated climate change and the solutions that need to be brought into play, and what should we be doing, I suppose?
Crikey.
I know, sorry, yeah. And if you could do that in 3 minutes, that'd be great. No.
What have we been doing wrong? So my studies, as well as being in literature, were then later in anthropology and political science, and sort of political, in particular, social movement theory and how change happens. And the kind of cultural landscape, I think, that we're coming out of, has been in what's the word of sort of hegemonic, let's say, not anti-pluralistic, is that we have been unable to imagine alternatives to modernity. Modernity has been this kind of, this is the only way, as Margaret Thatcher said in the 1980s. There is no alternative, and for various reasons, I think first through the Cold War, but then through the end of the Cold War, we've been fed this narrative of progress, which I think, I've always been a little bit skeptical about, but I think now is very much on the ropes. So that idea of progress, I think, has been hugely debilitating. Then I think we have the sort of nuts and bolts of politics and the lobbying of industrial interests and commercialism and finance capital and fossil capital and all of those sorts of things, which have narrowed the democratic space. You look at a country like Costa Rica; they've managed to turn their country around from a 20%, 30% remaining forest back to 50, 60%, and a very equal, happy society, and so on. So it's not impossible with the right democratic leadership. And what do we need to do? I would say, as a society, we need a lobotomy, quite frankly. But that's enormously challenging because it literally means, rethinking, the role of oil in where we sit and how we think of space and time. And my home is an hour and a half from here, but only if you go in a bus, or a car. So there is an enormous leap that needs to be made, and yet, we're getting there. Every week there's more and more positive examples which need to be celebrated. If we want to talk about narrative, it's we've got to be telling those positive stories of hope and examples, whilst also being real. So we are not going to limit warming to 1.5. We're not going to limit warming to 2. because that depends on very, very steep emissions cuts, and they're still going up.
Yeah.
So we need to be talking about what does a 2.5 degree, 3 degree world look like? What does that mean for how we educate people, how we plan our cities, what we demand of our politicians, how many reservoirs we're building, where we're building. Swansea will be, battling tidal floods within a decade. Large areas of real estate will be in jeopardy. So, we need to take that stuff seriously, whilst also saying this is a huge opportunity to reimagine a more just future. And thankfully, we're in Wales, where we have, one of the most progressive governments, certainly the most progressive government in the UK, one of the most progressive governments in Europe, which is open to these questions, which is taking the science seriously, which, is hobbled by the amount of money it has, but not by its vision, which is in most European countries the other way around.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to be hopeful about. There's a lot of local, municipal, I think, and exciting stuff happening at the city level and so on.
And that's maybe where the storytelling needs to pivot
Yeah.
from the truths of the science, which need to be told, but towards the solutions as
opportunity.
well.
Yeah,
That's
the
sort of where-
opportunity.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. The opportunity, the excitement. I'm going to stop talking now because I'm keen to leave you time to ask Ben some questions. But did you say, is there a short extract from the tree line that you'd like to read?
I mean, I don't have to. I can.
Well, it would be lovely to hear from it, but I also want to give people time to
Yeah.
ask questions.
Let's
So
do
let's, if anyone has got any questions or anything you'd like to talk to Ben about, now's the time. Yeah, thanks.
When you talked about like the 6 different characters of trees, like from this studying of that, do you think there were 6 different solutions for each sort of character, or is it very sort of general across all of them?
Well, what was interesting about that is that each of those trees is a keystone species anchoring a particular ecosystem and a particular economy and culture that has risen up on the basis of the characteristic of that species, which is fascinating, which means that there are particular problems in each place which are locally specific. So, for example, in Scandinavia, the downy birch is the kind of the heart of the Sami culture, the indigenous reindeer herders in Lapland. They use birch for everything. But because of the way that the downy birch is responding to warming, it's literally blanketing the tundra and eliminating all the grazing for the reindeer. It's become the enemy of their traditional culture. So the sort of preferred solution is to try and cut the birch as much as possible, but the Forestry Service of Norway can't do that. They've tried it, it doesn't work. The birch just is going nuts. So the solution there is much more existential, is that the Sami have to consider the end of the reindeer herding way of life. You've got a very different scenario in Russia, where the larch actually has co-evolved with the permafrost. So there's this beautiful system that I found out about, where larch breathe through their roots, and the oxygen comes from the spaces within the permafrost where the ice crystals create voids in the soil. But as soon as the permafrost melts and the root system gets waterlogged, the larch suffocate and they drown. And then when they drown, they all get drunk. So you get these drunk forests falling over. But what that means is the tree line is not zooming north. And what you have there instead is that all the inhabitants of the forest move north because of the temperature. So you have all these birds that are normally found lower down in the border with Ukraine and stuff like that are now on the Arctic Ocean, that are forest dwellers, but there's no forest. So there's lots of kind of very interesting, different, localized responses and scenarios, all of which might proffer different solutions, but I would hesitate to use the word solutions, really. It's not so much solutions, it's just changing context. Ecosystems are changing much, much faster than they ever did. You're accelerating geological processes on an ecological timescale. So something that would have taken 10,000 years or 30,000 years or even 1 million years is suddenly happening in a matter of decades. And that the solution to that, there is no solution to that. What there is a process of adaptation and all kinds of new configurations in which humans may or may not have a role to play, and that means we have to listen. It means we have to pay attention. It means we have to observe. We have to be implicated in that ecosystem if we want to be able to rely on the ecosystem services that ecosystem provides. Because even as it's transforming, it's still providing food, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, water, all the things that we need to survive, that cities need to survive in those places. So what it means is not, it's not so much a solution. I would say it's a different kind of paying attention.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because that quality of paying attention and being curious, which you talk about in the epilogue here as being vital to a new relationship with the earth, is at the heart of what you do as a writer as well.
Yes, I think that applies to probably artists more generally. It's a sort of an artistic temperament, I think, and which is why, of course, teaching the arts in schools is absolutely foundational. That's about what it means to be human. Being an artist is the sort of fullest expression of being a human in the world. So as a society, one of the things that we need to do is that we need to behave more like artists in terms of how we observe and how we pay attention. I would say so, and that's what one of the key elements of the curriculum at Black Mountains College is creative practice and doing that. But at moments of big change, ask of us foundational questions, just like, it's like an extended 1939. What does it mean to be human? What are you prepared to die for? What are you prepared to glue yourself to a building for? Those are the questions which arise at moments of rupture, which is where we are now. And it means we need to reevaluate what we think it means to be human. That happened after 1945. What do we think it means to be humans in a society? It was a fundamental reappraisal of the 20s and the 30s.
Yeah, and the answer to that shaped the world.
Indeed.
Right up until now.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah, there's one from over there.
Is there really any hope for us and for the climate given the current political and economic structures? The fact that production does and must take place for profit, and its growth come what may. I mean, even the Conservative government has admitted that they can't control the markets, whatever they do. So no matter how benign a government might be, you mentioned the Welsh government, is there really anything they can do?
There's loads of things they can do. They work for us. They're supposed to, and democracy functions if you can mobilize enough people. And I think the American midterms this week are a really good example of that. The Democratic Party is reinventing itself, is working incredibly hard with unions, with organizing the Green New Deal, which is campaigning on behalf of particular candidates who sign up to the right principles. They delivered, I don't know if it's 20 or 30 House seats, but they got the left-leaning candidates who supported the Green New Deal into office. It's that level of social movement that's required to get the right representatives in office to then support the right kinds of policies. I mean, I'm the first to denigrate the political status quo. I worked in the House of Commons for a while. I personally, would hate that job, but it works, But the way that it works is through, I think we've lost sight of the amount of work that's required to make it work, if you sort of mean, to make it function.
Yeah.
The huge levels of organisation that we had, and South Wales is a brilliant example, when Winston Churchill was terrified of civil war in 1913, and it was that terror, when they're afraid, that's when they passed the legislation that's in favour of working people and human rights and the right kind of and the right outcomes. So they've got to be afraid, and it's our job to make them afraid. And the only way you do that is through numbers. So I would say I would never give up. I would never give up hope in the political system. I would acknowledge the difficulty and the scale of the challenge to make it move. But I also think there is hope in terms of all of the actions that are happening at local level, at council level, at municipal level, at all of the cities in the world that are joining forces to sign non-proliferation, fossil fuel non-proliferation treaties, to pledge to completely eliminate fossil fuels from their supply chain like Amsterdam has just done. So there's an awful lot that can be done which will move the needle. I'm not optimistic about the climate. I think we will hit 3 degrees by 2100. I think I might see that in my lifetime. I think my children will see that. That means the remaking of the surface of the Earth. It doesn't mean the end of the human race. It means massive changes to how we organize and control agriculture and how much food we grow and where we grow it. And it means drought in Wales, even though it's the wettest part of Europe. You know, all of that will happen, but it's possible that we can organize and we can weather those things and we can have a semblance of stability. And even if we do have, it's very different, that doesn't necessarily mean people aren't going to fall in love, have parties, get drunk, dance, have a meaningful life. Because all of that happens in this refugee camp with people who are living on, a pound of rice a day. So a meaningful life is still possible, even if all of the trappings of our current status quo fall away. And it might even be less stressful and more fun, even though there might be higher levels of overall deprivation. Actually, you might, you yourself, your own experience, your own human experience, as some of these characters will show, could be more fulfilling and more rewarding.
I do want to check if there are any other questions, but I just want to acknowledge that the question was also, it was about economic models as well as the political models. So,
Right.
Can we make the changes we need to make with an economic model of free market capitalism and persistent growth on a planet of finite resources?
No.
No, fine. So yes, that needs to change, yeah. Also, there's one here, and then we'll come to Anne up there, yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, in Treeline and generally, the conversation is very much about global warming. And as a lesser cousin is the destruction of habitat and the loss of ecological systems which support everything on Earth. And I wonder how far that's moving in concert when you talk about change. Because yes, we can move away from fossil fuels, but can we move away from this, Owen just referenced, the endless consumption
Yeah.
of land for the
Yeah.
minerals, for the wood,
Yeah.
for everything that allows us to continue to exist. Alongside that question, a completely different one. Why do you think your book was chosen for BBC Book of the Week? I'm not sure how this works, but I was just curious whether you have an insight on that.
Ooh, I wish I knew, because then I could make sure it happens every time. On the ecosystem destruction, you're absolutely right, and I think that is a much more challenging and more terrifying prospect than emissions in a way, because those are the things which are the pollinators in particular. It is a very good example, and the health of our waterways. If we can't keep all these rivers in, like the River Wye and the River Usk, and just up the road. So many people rely on those for their drinking water, and yet, we're killing those rivers in plain sight. So that is a major challenge, and in a way, it's the insect apocalypse is going to happen before the other stuff. So, and it's much harder to adapt to. So I would share your concern there. On the Book of the Week, I really don't know. I'm delighted that both those books were Book of the Week. But I think in both cases they are, because Book of the Week is non-fiction, so it's not Book at Bedtime, which is the fictional cousin. But I think in both cases they're topical, and I think they are. I think the format of the radio program is aiming for the same thing that I'm aiming for, which is a story which has a wider meaning and relevance, and I suppose I'm ticking that box.
I think, Anne, did you have a question? Yeah.
I really like the trees, all people moving, and I think
Yeah, I really enjoyed that book. And actually, I started The Tree Line with the idea of, how do we build nature connection? How can we make other species to be characters that we can write about? And then I think I was into chapter 2 or 3, and I read the overstory, and I thought, oh, shit. Because he does it very well, and it's huge. But I mean, obviously, I persisted, and they're different books and all the rest of it. But I think we read it in my book group, and we really struggled with this question because we thought, as a narrative of humans, it's quite flawed. But what is it about that book that is so compelling that makes you want to read on and keep reading? And actually, it's the science. For us, or at least for me, it was, oh my God, every page I'm learning amazing new things about all these different species and how forests function and all the rest of it. So that was also very edifying and helped in the writing of Tree Line, having the confidence that science can carry a story and that it's important to put it in there.
Time for one last question.
There's
Then
one over there, so sorry, yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
2.
Oh, were there 2? Oh, where was the second one as well? Okay, we'll have 1 and 2 just very quickly, and then we'll have to wrap up, I'm afraid. Yeah, thanks. Yes.
Thank you very much. Fascinating hearing you talk. I mean, you started off, it sounded like, with a great interest in human rights, and obviously has that experience that you had, which you picked about. But now it seems like you've moved on to being engaging in climate catastrophe. I mean, how do you think those two things interact? You said earlier on that the camp that you were in was indirectly a result of climate change in Africa. Do you think that there is a unifying answer here, that if we saw climate change, we might sort human rights out? Or how do you think they interact?
I think they interact in lots of ways, objectively, because climate justice is, climate change and climate justice go hand in hand. But I think what the common thread is for me personally is an interest in the human situation. So coming into having curiosity about the war and what's it like to live in a war zone, and how does culture survive, and are people still kind to each other and looking after each other? How do they find meaning in that situation? The same applies to City of Thorns, the same applies to climate change. So it's more, I think, about the human condition, if you like, under pressure in different circumstances.
Yeah, over there. Thanks.
You're trying to kind of make people think and act differently. What do you think about the balance between the sort of scary, terrifying, and then the hopeful? And is there a question of honesty in there as well?
I think there's absolutely a question of honesty, and I think one of the things that I was very concerned about with Tree Line is presenting the facts in an unvarnished way. I think people need to be treated as adults. And the problem with the science is not that it's frightening. It's just that it's not communicated well enough, and it's because it's so complicated and complex, and there's so many elements to it. How do you communicate uncertainty, especially in a media culture which only deals in sound bites? So the beauty of a book is that you do have the chance to extrapolate on all of that. There's some quite good social science about climate communication and the role of realism, but also people's reaction to realism, i.e. fear, in how we communicate. So the sort of conventional shorthand from a lot of climate scientists and climate communicators is, you've got to have hope. Where's the hope? To the extent that often you then get the hope shoehorned in, or manufactured, or false hope, which actually undermines the overall message, because people don't like to be patronized. They want they want something that's truthful, and I think readers and watchers can smell when something's not truthful, and especially if they're getting a whole plethora of messages from social media or media more broadly, they're going to want a story that accounts for that. And that's where the communicating uncertainty comes in. So I think it's got to be true. I think it's always hopeful if you can properly contextualize it. So the point about the epilogue in Treeline is, yes, we're heading for a world which is completely remade, but there is always opportunity there. There are always options. So actually it means we have to redefine hope. What do we mean by that? Do we think that hope is the maintenance of the American dream or the affluent status quo? Or is hope actually just about having options? Because for those guys in the refugee camp, hope means, you've got a story for the day that you can hang your hat on, and tomorrow the story might be something else. But it's just simply that you've got something to look forward to that's going to get you through the day. So, I think we've been quite complacent about hope. I don't think we really know what it means, because it's never really been tested with this idea of progress, especially in the media, which broadly represents kind of affluent life experiences. So I would say, yes, hope has to be there, but it has to be redefined, and I would say, yes, it has to be real. Otherwise, it's not hope. It's a lie.
It's that concept of radical hope, isn't it?
Radical
Where
hope.
you have an unflinching gaze, which is, of course, something that Raymond Williams wrote about. But as you say in here, a struggle, it's struggle that creates hope. And unfortunately, we are going to have to wrap it up there. But hopefully you'll buy the whole book. But if you don't buy the whole book, do just read that epilogue, because I think it is, I'm not just saying this because you're here, it's the most elegant few pages that I've read that both sort of summarise our current situation, but also very much summarise that position of radical hope in a way that certainly the book needs, but I feel that I needed at the end of reading it as well. So thank you for that, Ben, and thank you to all of you for joining us here. If you've enjoyed the series, which I hope you have, then please do come back for the fourth and the final event in the series with the amazing short story writer and novelist Sarah Hall. That's on the 24th of November. And I think if you come early, there's an event downstairs about Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas. So you can get 2 events for the price of 2 events, actually. So, although the one downstairs might be free, I don't know, walk in as if you've got a ticket. Yes, thank you for being here. Ben will be outside for a bit. I'm going to have to whisk him away so that he gets to eat. But I'm sure that he'll be happy to sign books that are being sold by the brilliant independent bookshop from Mumbles, cover to cover. So do please have a chat to Ben and do please buy a book. But lastly, will you join me in thanking Ben for a fantastic conversation? Thank you. Marianne.